Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is John Boesnecker. John is an acclaimed historian of the old American West. He is a New York Times best-selling author and his books have won numerous awards. So welcome, John, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, today we're going to talk about John's book, Wildcat, and that's a book about a truly remarkable woman from the Old West. And her name is Lily Davy, or Pearl Hart, which is, to use the name she eventually adopted. And John, I'm not quite sure where to start the story because Lily had such a complicated life. And feel free to sort of introduce this as you like, but I thought we might start with maybe the most notorious part of her career, which was holding up the stagecoach at Cane Spring Canyon.
Yes, and if you watch Western television shows, Western films, it's very common to see women outlaws. And very common thing in the Western movies is the cowgirl wearing blue jeans and a brace of six shooters and a cowboy hat. You see it in almost every Western. That never existed. There were no such thing as cowgirls in the Old West. There were cowgirls, but they worked for Buffalo Bill Cody, and they were performers in his Wild West show in the 1880s and 1890s. In the Old West, in most of the 19th century America, most communities, it was unlawful for women to wear men's clothing and vice versa. So if a woman ventured out in trousers, she'd be subject to being arrested. And this is why it was so shocking when Pearl Hart, a woman, robbed a stagecoach on the Arizona frontier in 1899. So Arizona Territory in 1899 was still a rugged frontier, even though most of the rest of the United States, especially on the East Coast, was modernized with paved roads, power lines, newly installed telephone lines. Arizona, very different. In all of Arizona Territory, which is today the state of Arizona, there were only two railroads that entered the territory, and most of the transportation was on remote stage roads that went through the high desert and the rugged mountains. And this is where Pearl Hart and her partner, a guy named Joe Boot, held up and robbed a stagecoach. She later claimed that she did it to get money to return to the Midwest to visit her sick mother, which is not true. She clearly did it to get money, but she and her partner obtained horses, pistols, rifles, masks. They picked a spot on a stage road from a very wealthy mining camp called Globe, Arizona, where gold and silver was shipped out by stagecoach to the railhead at Florence, Arizona. And this is a very remote area. In fact, the stage road today, you can't even get to it. You could hike there, but you certainly can't drive a four-wheel drive vehicle on the stage road anymore. It's that remote, and it's been eroded away over the years. So this is a very remote area that she and Joe Boot chose as the spot to hold up a stagecoach.
And you mentioned her male clothing, but what's quite interesting in the book is that it's quite clear that she starts to wear male clothing from really quite a young age. And it's never quite clear to me what's going on there. Why does she do this, do you think?
Well, do you want me to go back and start at the beginning a little bit, and you can kind of...
We can dot all over the place because I think it does.
Okay.
So it does go back to the start of her life a bit, doesn't it?
Yes. So Pearl Hart was born in 1871 in the remote North Woods of Ontario, Canada, well north of Toronto. And she grew up in abject poverty, as did probably the majority of people in the North Woods. They raised chickens and small livestock. The menfolk hunted in the forest to help feed the family. The children, if they were lucky, got a few years of education. There wasn't even a law in Canada that children were required to attend school until sometime in the early 1880s. So Pearl, and she came from a very large family, 8 siblings who lived to adulthood. They were extremely bright, all of them. But because they grew up in abject poverty, they began stealing at an early age, stealing food. And one of the tricks that Pearl and her brothers would do is they'd steal a cow, and then they'd drive it into another village, then they'd sell it, then they'd sneak back in and steal it back and drive it to another village and sell it again. And all of them were in and out of these reformatories in Ontario. And finally, Pearl and her sisters, they were all very beautiful. And her brother later said that Pearl accepted too many dates with nefarious young men. But in any event, the girls, in order to survive, turned to prostitution at a very early age, 13, 14 years old. And the father, Albert Davy, was the name of the father, and Pearl's real name, as you mentioned, was Lily Davy. Albert Davy, Pearl always called him a worthless wretch. He was a rapist. He served several years in the penitentiary of Ontario for attempting to rape a 14-year-old girl. So to me, it seems pretty evident that he probably molested his own daughters. All of them were sexualized at a very early age. And to escape this horrible trauma, Pearl and her sister Katie, who were as thick as thieves in a literal and literary sense, they would run away from home and they'd dress as boys. They'd borrow their brother's clothing. There's even in my book, I found a wood engraving taken from a photograph in the 1880s of them wearing their boys' clothes. And they did this to avoid unwanted sexual advances. So what they would do is they'd come down to the Great Lakes, they'd hitch a ride on a steamer across to New York State, they'd jump on a freight train, they'd beat their way west to Buffalo, New York. At one point, they went all the way to Chicago. Another point, they even made it as far west as Minnesota. And they would steal on the way. They'd steal food from peanut butchers, which were the young boys that sold peanuts and other treats on railroad trains. So that's how Pearl initially began wearing men's clothing, and she later said that she liked it. She found it more comfortable, which is, as we know, probably a majority of women today find men's clothing more comfortable than traditional women's clothing.
It's just such an odd thing that she comes across quite often as a very feminine person. There's nothing tremendously masculine about her, although she does seem to have dominated certainly the man that took part in the stagecoach robbery with her. But nonetheless, as you say, she comes across as a very beautiful woman. So this sort of mix of this masculine and feminine, it's just slightly mysterious to me.
Yes, and her sister Katie was very similar. Katie was very glamorous, had a long career later in life as an adult, had a long career as an actress. She was a pioneer balloonist.
Can we just say a bit more about the ballooning? Because that made my eyes pop out of my head, that in order to sort of make some money, she suddenly decides to become a balloonist and what's more, a parachutist to boot.
Yes, so her family basically ends up in Kansas City, Missouri, and she meets a sort of a notorious entertainer who's a balloonist and skydiver. And this was the mid-1890s. It's the beginning of aeronautics. And so one of the very popular pastimes was to go to a county fair and watch a parachutist ascend by a hot air balloon up to several thousand feet or more. Then he would cut loose and parachute to the ground. And people just could not believe this. It was so risky. Most people today, me included, would never parachute out of an airplane if you put a gun to my head. But Katie, she's just a young woman in her late teens, early 20s. And she hooks up with this guy. And like every man she was with, she called herself his wife. So they clearly had a sexual relationship. And then she performed in Texas. She did this skydiving in San Antonio. She did it in Austin. And huge crowds came out to see her. And at one point, she had an accident with the parachute. She plunged into the lake that's near downtown Austin. And she, local men went out on a rowboat and rescued her. And she eventually stopped doing that because I think she realized this is really, really dangerous. Although both sisters, everything they did was dangerous. Being prostitutes in that era was very, very dangerous.
I wanted to ask you about the prostitution because one of the things that I didn't quite understand is that I sort of had assumed that prostitutes of that time, venereal disease must have been rife, and presumably unwanted pregnancy must have been rife, and yet I don't get a hint of that from your book.
Yes, and it's kind of an interesting topic. A number of women historians years ago pointed out that, the Wyatt Earp and his brothers were among the most famous today Westerners. And in particular, one woman historian pointed out that it's kind of interesting that the brothers who were gamblers and pimps, which would be Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Warren Earp, the ones who encountered the cowboys in Tombstone, 3 of them were at the gunfight at the OK Corral. None of them ever had children. Virgil had a daughter when he was young, but then later he remarried and never had children throughout the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, even though their wives were all of child, and they were all married. But the issue there was that this, in particular, women historians seem to have an insight into human nature that most of us men are too dumb to pick up on, But in particular, they pointed out to me that these brothers, the Earp brothers, probably had a venereal disease, which rendered them, unable to have children, which is a pretty common side effect of a venereal disease. And what's kind of interesting is that their wives, all of whom were prostitutes, also did not have children, probably because of the same reason. In many cases, Virgil Morgan was married, 7, 8 years before he was killed following the gunfight at the OK Corral. Wyatt and Virgil were married for like 50 years, 40 years, something like that, never had children. So when you look at the fact that Pearl had, by her own statement, had a boy and a girl, her sister Katie had a son. Both the children were born when Pearl and Katie were in their 20s. That's kind of interesting. And then Pearl had another daughter a bit later when she was probably about 30. She had a daughter who then lived for many, many years. And that daughter was born after Pearl had given up her life as a prostitute. So she had children before she became a prostitute. And 15, 20 years later, 15 or more, she has a daughter after she gave up that life. So, it may simply be an anomaly. There was, kind of primitive birth control back then. I think condoms were made out of animal intestines, that kind of thing. Maybe that's what they did. And then the other sisters had children as well, Pearl's other sisters, and all of them engaged in prostitution. And it was common in that era, though, especially in the American West, because women were so scarce. There was a shortage of women, in Arizona Territory. I can't recall the exact statistic, but it was about 2/3 male, about 1/3 female. And so women were highly prized. Women were special because they were rare, and there was a lot of competition to get eligible women. And many prostitutes in the West were not held in that same level of disrepute that they were in the civilized part of the country, the East Coast. And so many prostitutes left the business, married, raised families, and never looked back. So it may not be as odd as we think it is today.
And I think you mentioned in your book that there was a sense that the Western states were so keen to attract women that they tended to be a little bit more forward-looking when it came to women's rights than maybe they were in the East.
Yeah, that's true. Women received the right to vote in Montana very early on. They got the right to vote in Arizona Territory early on, or at least when Arizona achieved statehood. And that's clearly because of this idea that we want to attract women out here. In California, the Mexican-Spanish system of community property, which meant that each spouse owned half of everything. When California reached statehood in 1850, they adopted the community property rule, as did most of the other states that were former Mexican territories. And they did that because they wanted to attract women to our isolated frontier. Come out here, you'll be treated like a man, at least with respect to property rights. And that's how it worked. And still, community property laws exist in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California.
And you mentioned that Lily or Pearl came from a very large family. What really struck me, though, was that it was a very large family, and I don't know how common that was at the time, but I think they all survived. Maybe one didn't survive, but was that normal to have so many of the children survive like that?
The infant death rate and childhood death rate was very, very high in the 19th century. And my grandmother's family, my grandmother was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899, and I believe half of her siblings didn't make it out of childhood. So I think, yes, of the 9 children, for 8 to reach adulthood, very unusual, and showed how healthy they were. Most of Pearl's sisters lived until the 1940s and 1950s. I was 2 years old when Katie died in the mid-1950s, and I'd give anything to spend an hour with her. I've got so many questions I would love to ask her about the family. She's just this absolutely fascinating person. And some people have told me that they want me to write a book about the sister, Katie Davy. But the problem is that these Davy sisters, they used assumed names. They knew that they were really, really bad when they were younger. And so they reformed. And Pearl Hart, she married several times, used various names, then finally used her real name with her husband's name, and lived in Los Angeles, dying there in 1935 as like a lower middle class housewife, helping raise her 2 granddaughters. And so they went from the whole gamut, from abject poverty to wild crime to middle-aged respectability, all in their lifetime. And I think that is what makes the story so unusual.
I can understand why people wanted a book written about Katie, because not only does she leap out of balloons and parachute and come very close, as you say, to killing herself, but then she's shot in the back, isn't she? By, is it her husband, or I don't know, the Davy women seem to have very bad taste in men.
They had horrible taste in men. Their father was bad. And this is something that we see today. You see troubled young women marry men very much like their abusive fathers. And so that's exactly what these girls did. Their father was a worthless wretch, to use Lily, Pearl's words. And most of them hooked up with men that were very much like him. But they did have enough sense to get rid of these men. At some point, they dumped the bad men in their lives and then either had no man after that or got a good man.
Then Katie gets shot. Do you want to just tell us about that? Because I just thought it was such a surprising part of the story.
Yes, so Katie was, like Pearl and the other sisters, extremely bright, very beautiful. I have several photographs of her in the book. She's very stunning, gorgeous, in fact. And so after she leaves this career as a parachutist, she becomes an actress. She's highly intelligent, and she writes plays. I mean, they're melodramatic. They're probably today, they're totally preposterous. But for a girl who probably had a 4th or 5th grade education, to be able to do this is simply unbelievable. So she wrote a play based on her sister's life called The Arizona Female Bandit. And while Pearl, and we'll get to this in a bit, but while Pearl is serving time in Yuma Penitentiary, the most notorious prison in the Old West, Katie is touring the Midwest performing this play, but focusing on her bad choice of men. She's so gorgeous, she has 3 guys after her all at the same time while she's trying to put this play on in Omaha. And it's like not a love triangle, it's like a love quadrangle or something like that. So what happens is she tries to dump one guy who's got money for another guy who's got more money. And finally, the jilted lover confronts her in her hotel room, shoots her, almost kills her, then turns the gun on himself and blows out his brains. And her mother rushes from Kansas City to care for her, but nobody puts two and two together. Nobody puts a connection. Well, why is this young woman doing a play about Pearl Hart, who's the most notorious woman in America? They just don't put two and two together. And Katie would never admit that these siblings were like, they stuck together like glue, which again is something very common with abused children. They stick together because they know that they're the only ones that they can trust. They've been abused by their parents. They've been abused by caregivers, by foster parents, whatever it is. And it creates this inseparable bond. And that's what happened with the Davies siblings. And so Katie, even though she's basically on her deathbed in a hospital, she won't tell anybody who her real family is. She won't tell her real name. And so then that eventually she recovers from her gunshot wound and she becomes a reasonably successful actress. She writes plays. She goes into court and makes up stories when her brothers would get arrested and sent to prison for stealing and burglaries and horse theft in the Midwest. She would go and her sister Pearl, who by this point wouldn't show her face. Her sister is eventually released from Yuma prison, but Pearl would not go to these court hearings because she was scared to death someone would figure out this lady is Pearl Hart, and if she shows up in court, my brother is absolutely going to get convicted by a jury if they find out that he's my brother, right? Mm. So Katie, though, would show up in court a number of times, perjure herself. She broke out. She attempted to break her one of her brothers out of jail. Her husband, who was this complete kook who she eventually divorced, he was a kind of a kooky actor, entertainer who joined the army during the Spanish-American War in 1898. She broke him out of jail twice. She smuggled a gun in, broke him out of jail in Oklahoma. Later, he was arrested and locked in the brig or the military prison in San Antonio, Texas. And she smuggled in another gun and broke him out of that jail. And then she ends up as an actress in Hollywood. She later said that she acted in numerous silent films. She was an acting coach, and she even wrote a science fiction novel in the early 1940s. And you can still buy it online. But what I point out in my book is that she'd have been much more successful if she wrote a factual biography of her life and her sister's life. But the problem is nobody would have believed it.
And you mentioned that she was breaking people out, and that seems to be a theme of the book. The number of escapes from jail is just extraordinary. And do you want to say something about that? Because was that normal? Were the jails just incredibly leaky, or were they particularly desperate individuals?
Well, the jails in the American West were very leaky. The training of the individual officers was very haphazard. You had police departments like New York and San Francisco, which were highly professional. The spoil system was eliminated. Officers would not be fired every time a Republican administration would come in every 4 years. In the old system, all of the police officers and firemen were political appointees, so they'd all get fired every 4 years. It was impossible for anybody to have a career in law enforcement when you get fired every 4 years. But San Francisco, some of the big East Coast cities that were pioneers in law enforcement, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, pioneered modern policing. And so in the American West, you had rural communities. Many of the jails were just log cabins. Sometimes prisoners were simply chained to a post in the ground, chained to a bed in a hotel room. But in Arizona Territory, they did have decent jails, and they had very experienced law officers because the crime rates were so high. We've talked about Wyatt Earp and his brothers. So the lawmen, today, the average police officer serves 30 years, never fires his gun in the line of duty. In England, of course, most police officers don't have a gun unless you're in those special services, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the 19th century, if you're working in the frontier, a Texas Ranger, for example, most Texas Rangers were in multiple gun battles with smugglers, cattle thieves, outlaws, robbers. That's why the history of the Texas Rangers is so fascinating. Same thing with the Arizona Rangers, which were modeled after the Texas Rangers. Because everybody in the 19th century wore firearms, bad guys wore 2 firearms, they didn't want to go to jail, and there was a lot more gunplay in the Old West. And the homicide rates prove it. The homicide rates in the American West were many, many times Americans' current homicide rates. So that's a long explanation of the kind of haphazard law enforcement in the frontier communities. And so what happened was you combine this haphazard law enforcement with the scarcity of women. And there was this natural inclination that men could not believe that women could commit a crime.
Right.
Women were often brought before juries, charged with shooting their husband, poisoning the husband, and all the men had to hear was that the guy was mean to the wife and they'd acquit the woman. There definitely were women in prison. In Yuma prison had 300 or 400 convicts while Pearl was there. But when she first went there, she was the only woman. And by the time she left, there were only 4 women out of hundreds of convicts. So you had a very low incarceration rate for women because the juries were all male at that time. Women were not allowed to serve in juries in many Western states until the 1940s. So you had a situation in which, definitely there was sexism, but this was a kind of sexism that worked to the advantage of women who fell afoul of the law. And so in Pearl's case, she broke out of the jail in Tucson, Arizona. And the guy in charge of the jail was one of the most famous lawmen in the history of the American West. His name was Bob Paul. He'd been a lawman in the California Gold Rush in the early 1850s. He hired Wyatt Earp as a shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo and Tombstone. He was a close friend of the Earp brothers, been a lawman for 4 decades, and he was undersheriff of Pima County, and Pearl Hart was his prisoner. Pearl, getting ahead of the story here, but Pearl had been captured after a long desert manhunt by a horseback posse led by another very capable sheriff, and she was acquitted, or at first a jury hung or acquitted her. All-male jury could not believe she would rob a stagecoach. And according to some early accounts, she flirted with the jurors, she flirted with the prosecuting attorney, she batted her eyelashes. She's very attractive, obviously. And the judge was so angry, there was a second charge against her. There were several robbery charges against her, all relating to the same stage holdup. And he ordered her retried on a second charge, chewed out the jury. A new jury came in and convicted her, and she's sentenced to Yuma Penitentiary. But while she's awaiting her trial, she's locked up in the jail, the county jail in Tucson, because it's seen as a more secure jail than the jail in Florence, Arizona. So all Pearl does is she seduces one of the trustees, who's a trusted prisoner, like a short-term prisoner, who's allowed out of his cell, and he does odd jobs around the jail. So she just seduces him. That's not tough for her. She's seduced hundreds of men in her career. And he then sneaks in at night, breaks through the wall. And Bob Paul didn't even want to put her in the jail. There's a special woman's room next to the jail in the courthouse, which he has set up. Pearl was a morphine addict, so he had a doctor come in every day and give her a dose of morphine to reduce the withdrawal symptoms, And so Bob Paul, in his kindness, and here's a guy who's killed I believe, if I recall correctly, 5 or 6 or 7 outlaws from 1853 through the late 1880s. He killed 3 train robbers in one gun battle in Mexico after a long manhunt, killed other outlaws in the California Gold Rush, took part in I don't know how many gunfights, but his heart is bleeding for Pearl Hart. I mean, he's the toughest lawman in the Southwest, and he provides her with a special room. It's got a sofa, a bed, a table where she can sit. She gets newspapers every day. She got all kinds of visitors come. Paul even allows her, thank goodness, allows her to hold unloaded firearms, wearing her men's clothing, armed to the teeth. And thank goodness he did that for posterity's sake. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what she looked like. And there were multiple photographers came into the jail, correspondents for Cosmopolitan magazine, which is still then and now the leading women's magazine in the United States, interviewed her. And she told this long story, heavily fictionalized, about her life, and of course didn't give her real name. But in any event, she breaks out of that jail, and she eventually ends up in Yuma Penitentiary, makes an effort there to escape the penitentiary. That time it doesn't work.
Well, Yuma is impossible, isn't it? It's the highest of high securities. Well, it's just impossible because of where it's located as much as anything.
That's very true. It's in the desert, very remote, near the Mexico border. And if anybody did escape, the local Indians were expert trackers, and they knew that there was an automatic reward offered for any escapee. So they just put the word out, and these Indian manhunters would track them down very quickly. So it was pretty much impossible to escape from Yuma. There were some escapes, but very few.
I was struck by what you said about Bob Paul's kindness, because one of the things, and I'm interested in your reaction to this to see if I've got this right, America seems like quite a small country when you write about it. For example, the husbands seem to have no difficulty in tracking down their wives, even though they've changed their names and they're working in some, small town, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. The siblings always seem to be able to find each other quite easily. In some ways, it seems like quite a small town, and the lawmen always seem to be able to catch up with the people they're looking for. It doesn't seem easy to disappear in the Old West, or maybe in America of the time. Have I got that about right?
Well, I think in this particular case, it's partly right and partly not right, because in this case, the siblings were so close, they would keep in touch by writing. And unfortunately, really none of this correspondence exists anymore. I'm hoping, since my book has come out, maybe some family members will find some of these letters. That would be wonderful. But they did keep in touch. So when Pearl, she finally marries this abusive piano player who she meets in the Midwest. His name is Dan Bandman, but he's very abusive. They have a couple children. She finally leaves the children with her mother and her sister to be raised and comes out to Arizona Territory to escape him. But she writes regularly to her siblings and to her mother, so they always know where she is. And eventually Dan Bandman wants to get back to her, so he goes back to the family and somehow inveigles them into revealing where she is. And that's pretty much how they kept in touch. When Katie found out, and this was published in every newspaper in America, when Pearl Hart was captured and then lodged in Yuma prison, the newspapers kept a pretty close watch on her. So Katie knew that she was there, so she hooks up with another guy who's a railroad employee, tells everybody he's her husband, which is, she had countless so-called husbands, and she obviously gets free transportation from the Midwest to Yuma and comes in and visits her sister and is allowed to come in and visit. So they were able to keep in touch that way. But for the most part, people were easily able to disappear in the American West. It was, Horace Greeley said, go west, young man. I call one of my book chapters, Go West, Young Women, because it applied to women as well as men. It was a place where people could go out, get a homestead, government land. They could get 180 acres settle on it. If they worked it for a certain number of years, they would get ownership of the land. It was something that was meant to encourage settlement. And there were so many opportunities. So this is where the surplus population would come west. And typically I tell everybody when I give talks about the Old West, the people that joined the gold rush, the silver rush, the cattle rush, the land rush, they weren't the responsible son of the family in upstate Maine or upstate New York, the son that had 3 children, had the family farm, ran the local mill or the local hardware store. It was the younger brother, the black sheep who got the neighbor girl pregnant, who owed everybody in town money. Those are the people that often went west to create a new life for themselves. And absolutely, that's what happened with Pearl Hart.
And you mentioned that Cosmopolitan comes out to interview her. And one of the things that's very striking in your book is how much you've managed to get from the newspapers of the time. I'm sort of very struck, I guess, by the quality of the newspapers and the quality of the reporters. Is that a sense you had reading it? Because the writing seemed to be of quite a high standard.
Yes, the journalists in the 19th century are all very educated. You'll often see in the middle of a news report, there'll be a reference to some Latin phrase, there'll be a reference to Shakespeare, there'll be a quote from some classic literature. And I know historically newspapers were written for the reader with a 6th grade education, because that would have been the typical education in the United States between the 1850s and the 1930s. There's certainly, college educated people were very unusual, but most of these journalists really were not college educated. They were just extremely well read, voracious readers. Many of them were probably self-educated, so the caliber of the writing was excellent. The dark side of the story is that this was also the era of yellow journalism that was generally, accredited with...
Sorry, what is yellow journalism? I don't know the phrase.
So yellow journalism was something that was credited with being created by William Randolph Hearst of the Hearst newspapers. And Hearst was one of the most famous / notorious men in the United States from the late 1880s up through his death in, the early 1950s. The movie Citizen Kane was based on his life. And yellow journalism was kind of what we're seeing today. And I'm not going to mention but the far left and the far right in the United States, there are cable news channels, which is very much like yellow journalism. It's journalism that's slanted, biased, fake news on the far left and the far right. And that's nothing new. It's what they had in the 19th century. And William Randolph Hearst took this kind of lack of journalistic ethics, lack of journalistic integrity, and took it to the nth degree and created what became known as yellow journalism because of the so-called yellow boy, who was an early cartoon character. And this was a type of fake news, bogus interviews, false news stories, anything to sell newspapers and make a buck. And so you had both, highly ethical journalists that were probably a majority of the small town reporters, because they, if they published a false story about a local blacksmith, there'd be a knock at the door and they probably wouldn't be able to publish their newspaper for the next 3 months because they'd get the living hell beaten out of them, right? But William Randolph Hearst, he even, according to some accounts, one of his bodyguards, or at least his editor, Andy Lawrence was his editor in San Francisco, later in Chicago. And Lawrence was highly disreputable. And according to some fairly reliable accounts, his bodyguard was Wyatt Earp in the 1890s when Wyatt Earp was living in San Francisco. That's how bad their journalism was. They needed a famous gunfighter to protect them. And so that was the bad side of journalism in the 19th century.
The other impression I get from the book, but it does seem like there's an awful lot of newspapers in the United States at that time.
every community had a Democratic paper and a Republican newspaper. And people, complain about the same thing happening today, but that's been the way it's always been. But it is unfortunate. I don't mean to keep ragging on American journalism, but I do hope that journalism students listen to this and study what's happening today and compare it with what happened, 150 years ago. You'd think that we would have improved. And unfortunately, at least in some areas of journalism, it has not improved one iota.
I wanted to just read out a bit of your book because I just thought it was so good. It was from a reporter when Pearl is in jail. And I just want to give the quote because I just thought it was a beautiful bit of writing. It could have come out of something that Mark Twain did. So it's about where she's in jail and for some reason she's been given a pet mountain lion. I don't know why, but she gets to keep a pet mountain lion in her cell. And a lawyer turns up and he's got a dog with him. So your book says, as a Tucson newspaper reported, it was a volatile mix. And then the quote starts, a pet mountain lion, an innocent canine, an attorney, and Pearl Hart got mixed up on the second floor, rear of the courthouse yesterday. The attorney and the female bandit do not speak now, and the dog has no further use for inside the jail. And then we have the killer line, the story is too long for repetition. I just think that could come straight out of Mark Twain. I thought that was absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and I wish I knew the story, but that's the only, combing the newspapers, the way that I wrote the book was just, and I even mentioned this at the tail end of the book, was just mind-numbing searches of digital newspapers. And thank goodness that these newspapers have been digitized. Not all, I'd say probably of American newspapers, probably 10% have been digitized. But many of the major newspapers are digitally available. You can actually do word searches.
Brilliant.
So what I would do is search for every single variation of Pearl Hart's name, every single variation of Lily Davy's name, and eventually the story came together. In the old days, you'd have to go to a university library. In my case, I go to University of California at Berkeley and spend 8 hours reading newspaper microfilm, looking for a needle in a haystack. And this book would not have been possible before the internet and before these digital newspaper sites and digital genealogical sites.
She goes to Yuma. How long is her sentence and how much does she end up having to serve?
Pearl, when she was convicted, and again, this shows the disparity in treatment of men and women. She and Joe Boot were convicted of the same stage holdup. Joe Boot got 25 years in Yuma prison. Pearl Hart got 5 years for committing the same crime. She was pardoned out after 3 years. And there's a story that a notorious Arizona outlaw named Billy Stiles got her pregnant in prison. This is one of the most famous stories about Pearl Hart, and that it was a big scandal, and that's why the governor pardoned her. But like so many stories about Pearl Hart, that's a total crock. Billy Stiles wasn't even in Yuma at the time she would have gotten pregnant. So that's just a biological impossibility. But she is pardoned out on the condition that she leave Arizona territory. And it's kind of interesting that she promptly left, goes back to Kansas City, Missouri, got into a lot more trouble in Kansas City, Missouri, had very many other adventures in her life. But eventually she did come back. In the 1920 U.S. Census, she's living with her flaky husband and her daughter in Phoenix, which is the very town she'd been a notorious prostitute in 25 years before. And nobody apparently nobody recognized her. Or I'll tell you this, if the men recognized her, they certainly didn't admit it.
Yeah, that may be the truth of the matter. The women didn't know her and the men pretended not to know her.
Even in the stagecoach robbery, one of the men refused to identify himself. And one of the men identified her as Little Pearl. So it's very clear that that's why this guy didn't identify himself, because he knew Little Pearl from a brothel in either Globe or Phoenix or Tucson, which are the three main places that she worked as a prostitute in Arizona territory. So it's something that men just would not admit, that they recognized a prostitute. I think the prostitutes would see a man who'd been a John or a customer, and they'd pretend like they didn't know them. That was the sort of the custom back then.
And what's your assessment of her character? Because you must sort of get to like her because she's such a rich and interesting character. But was she genuinely a likable person, or what do you think?
Oh, I think she was definitely likable. I think all the sisters were likable. If you look at the stage robbery in a vacuum, yeah, that's really bad. They pointed guns. They stole the property from the passengers. Pearl was involved in many, many other nefarious activities during her lifetime. But when you look at where she came from, you look at the horrible abuse. Her mother was horribly abused. Her mother was the victim of a gang rape that I tell about in the book. The mother was as much a victim as the children were. It lets you see their lives in a different light. And I think that's what makes them sympathetic rather than evil characters.
Certainly nowhere in your book do I ever come across them being mean.
No, they're basically everything they do is for survival. They steal for survival. They engage in prostitution for survival. And so in one case, her brother, who was evidently or certainly gay, was involved in, sort of seducing or forcibly taking a young guy away from his family and ending up in Kansas City, Missouri. And that incident alone got a lot of press. That was probably one of the most disreputable things done by any member of the family except for Albert Davy. Albert Davy.
But he was mean. He was surely mean.
Very, very mean. And he finally gets stinking drunk and falls off his canoe in a remote lake up in the North Woods, and nobody mourned his passing.
One of the things I was taken by with Lily, or Pearl rather, was that at the time of the stagecoach robbery, she hands back some of the money, almost as an insult to the passengers.
Yes, and she also said to the reporters several times after she was captured, why do these men carry all these guns when they shake like a leaf and they're afraid to use them? So she did have a very strong personality. And as you mentioned before, the newspapers reported that when they'd interview her and Joe Boot, that Pearl Hart was plainly the leader of the pair.
I think we've done pretty good justice to the story of Pearl Hart, at least in the time that we got available. But I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend people to read the book Wildcat, because there is so much detail in it and there's so many side stories. It's absolutely fascinating. So really, do pick it up. And if people were to read your work, which is the book that you think would be the best entry into it?
Probably Wildcat. I think it's new, it's exciting, it appeals to both men and women. A lot of my books are pretty macho. They're about the Texas Rangers. They're about outlaws or lawmen. And believe me, a lot of women like them. But when I tell women that my new book is about a woman outlaw, they clap their hands. They really like that idea. So probably this book would be a good one to start with.
And are you working on another one at the moment?
Yeah, my new book, I'm close to finishing it. It's a biography of Black Bart, who's another Englishman. He was Charles Bowles was his birth name, born in just outside of Norwich in England, and brought to the United States with his family as a young, he's only two years old, and then eventually becomes the most famous stage robber of the American West using the alias Black Bart.
And hopefully he's a little bit more successful than Pearl Hart, who only managed the one and got caught straight away afterwards.
No, Black Bart robbed 32 stagecoaches in his career. By far the most successful stage robber and the most prolific stage robber. So this one is a fun story too.
And we can expect to see that, sometime next year?
Probably in about a year. And it also deals quite a bit with his wife and his daughters, who he abandons and leaves to a life of poverty while he's living as this popular gentleman in San Francisco. He's the life of the town, and nobody knows that he's this famous stage robber that every lawman on the West Coast is trying to capture, and he's living right under their noses.
Brilliant.
It's an amazing story.
Okay, well, I've taken up so much of your time, John. But thank you so much for talking today, because that's been an absolute delight.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.